Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBE Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
Yo, welcome to the VIBEZ Daily podcast. So excited to have you back here as a part of our year-long series titled Devoted, where we are going through the entire Bible, cover to cover, reading it in entirely. I still have with me my friends, Collin, Shameeka, and my wife, Victoria, to talk about it. And so we have 4 chapters to cover today, so we're going to jump right into it as we go through Genesis 14 through 17. Left off yesterday with Abram and Lot separating specifically, and now going their separate ways, God reminding Abram of his blessing in Canaan and what he was going to do. And then Lot gets into some more trouble as we get into chapter 14. And so we get this interesting story here where Abram becomes kind of warrior king of some sort. But anything that just jumped out to you guys in chapter 14, kind of this encounter with Abram, with these legion of kings that have come together that have kind of captured Lot and his willingness to go and save him. Anything that jumped out to you guys in chapter 14?
Oh, lot. Here we go again, back on the scene.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that it was just Lot's proximity and association with them that even got him in trouble in the first place. Which this was the area that he chose. Like you chose to live here and next to these wicked people, and I'm sure he didn't know at the time they were that wicked, but because of his choices, he's got caught up in some mess.
Yeah.
So I think it's important here to get some context because Genesis 14 can be a little bit confusing, but this really originated with the story of Ham and Shem, that these are the kings that derive from them, and how Noah says that Shem and Japheth will rule over Ham. And we see that Lot is actually going to Sodom and Gomorrah, who derived from Ham. And so now he's caught up in a war that had nothing to do with him, but because of, his idolizing Sodom and Gomorrah, now he's caught up in a war that's bigger than him.
Yeah. That's it's so deep in so many ways. And again, I just love what you guys have pulled out of that, because there is this conscious decision on Lot's part to be in that vicinity, in that space and place. Like you said, Ian, it's just his proximity to trouble, his proximity to mess, his proximity to war that has him being a bystander of sorts. And then as a result of that, now Abram has to step up and actually go save him and actually go step in, right? And it's now not only is he in the mess, but now he's pulled Abram into that mess, right? Because of where he's decided to be. And I just think that's, again, it's so emblematic of so much of kind of our life and things, the choices we make and how they impact others, right? How they, take us places that we probably shouldn't be, but then how often we pull others into that as well. So, yeah.
I think it was just interesting how Abram had so much notoriety that this random person who escaped was able to know who Lot belonged to, and came and found Abram, was like, "Hey, your boy Lot." And this is I also look and see that he had 318 trained men in his house. how wealthy and well established must you be to have like just the men is 318 of trained men, right? Who was able to go out with him. I'm just like, wow, like Abram had really made something of himself at the time, or at least the Lord had blessed Abram so much at this time that he had a lot, just not just money and possessions, but also of servants and notoriety.
Yeah. So I was going to actually touch on that, and I kind of took it a different way. I think like when we talk about like the 318, it was not just about like the verse doesn't say that when the tragedy struck and adversity happened that he went to go train the men, that they were already trained. And so I interpreted it as in the good seasons when Abram and Lot were having, fun and getting all this wealth, that Abram actually took time to train these men so that when the storm comes, y'all can go ahead and be well equipped to prepare for war.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, Lot, did you train your men or was you playing?
What y'all was out there doing for real.
Right, that's how you got caught up. Your men weren't trained, so you got captured. Yeah. It's good. Anything else kind of from this story? I mean, Abram gets pretty crazy. Don't typically associate Abram with being a warrior. That's not usually one of the things I consider, but this story definitely describes one. But anything else kind of from that before we get into kind of Melchizedek's response to that?
You see God's favor though on Abram. That's all. The fact that he wasn't a warrior, but still was able to go up against these kings. I think this goes to what we were saying earlier, where we just, at first, Abram didn't have faith that the Lord would like take care of him. He was always operating in fear, and I just feel like there seems to be like this shift in this moment where he is acting out, and the Lord shows up for him.
Yeah. Yeah. They said that same fear of like Egypt is just gone. Now he's willing to go up against all these kings here. Yeah. Very interesting. So, I mean, that favor obviously gets kind of translated here through a blessing that's given. So this is another now blessing that's come, not necessarily from God, but from a person, right? We get Melchizedek's kind of similar to what you pointed out about Noah a few days ago. But Melchizedek's blessing of Abraham, or Abram still at this point, anything that just jumped out to you about this blessing that Melchizedek places upon Abram?
Yeah, I just love the language of him saying like who God is, like the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Just hearing that language and even a heart posture to mention like who God is was beautiful for me to see.
And like, kind of like what you were saying, Eric, about these past 4 days is like, it says that Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And like, God doesn't say give him a tenth. And that offering and the idea that we have in the church today of tithing, it goes beyond just like a law. Like this has to be the posture of our hearts, that when God is mentioned, like I'm willing to give him that tenth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the fact that this King Melchizedek was a priest of God the Most High, and it does show me that like, although this is the story that we are reading in the lineage that we're following because it's the lineage of Jesus that's being highlighted, that God is still at work all throughout the earth.
Yeah.
That he still had people all throughout the earth, right? Like he was still speaking to people here, there, and everywhere. And he does show that like, although Israel, you were the chosen people, eventually Israelites were the chosen people, that like God never intended to be just that. Like he wanted to dwell with all of us.
Yeah.
And like that this, even we said with Abraham, like he was supposed to be a blessing to the entire earth, like so that people can know God and know him. So I do like to see when I see these little remnants of other people in the world that listen to God or know God or speak on God's behalf. It's just like, yeah, like you are everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah. I love just the contrast here. Going back to, we started in Babel kind of a couple days ago, that like Abram is conscious of that perception of like who gets the credit, right, for his faith or for who he becomes and what he has, right? Whereas like so many others were like concerned with them getting the credit for their greatness, Abram was very conscious of like, hey, I'm not going to take anything from you, because I want it to be clear that all that I have and all that I am is from God. And I don't want anybody else to try to take credit for that. Like, and again, I'm not even going to assume or accuse you of that. But I don't even want to give you the opportunity, like that when God does what he's going to do through me, that you going to sit back and go, oh yeah, but I made Abram. Like, I did that, you know what I'm saying? I gave him some stuff. And so like, I think it's important, again, this constant thing that we're seeing show up time and time again in these first 3 chapters of Genesis here is this heart posture and this this just call out of like, who gets the glory out of what we do? Is it God or is it man? Is it ourselves or is it others, right? And just kind of that focus there. And I love that Abram was very much conscious of that. And I think this is some of what set him apart and why, he was deemed righteous, by God, is because he was very conscious that like God gets the glory out of all of this. And it's not me specifically.
Yeah.
So moving to 15, and we get another covenant, right? So we had the covenant with Noah earlier. We get another covenant, and God does this specifically. Now, in this particular covenant, we also get an actual action with it, right? Versus just words. There's some things that God does to bind this covenant. But anything that just jumps out to you guys here in chapter 15, we'll just take this whole chapter kind of as a whole, but just this covenant that God makes with Abram. And then it jumps out to you about what he said, how it was done, anything of that nature for you guys.
Yeah, for me, I was going to say, like, I love how God spoke to Abram in a different way through a vision. Like, first time I'm seeing it in the text, like, God speak in this different light. And specifically him telling Abram, do not be afraid. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. And what I love about this text is that God really spoke to what he knew that Abram was struggling with. Like, a lot of his decisions were fear-based. Like, a lot of his moves were fear-based. And God speaking in him in such a way to also, like, remind him, like, don't be afraid. Like, was amazing to really see that.
Yeah.
I don't think God is practical, because I think like Genesis 14 is very depressing. Like, when I know that I just saved Lot from a war and Lot still chooses to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, like, it's depressing to know that he could eventually die if he keeps going down this path. And like you said, like, this is the first time we see like the Lord speaking to him in a vision. I think because God realizes that Abram needs more than a word. He needs to see where I'm taking him.
Yeah. Which is why, going back to that text, he had him like, go ahead and like look around and like see what's here. Like, he knows like his son. Like, he literally knows like the things that he typically gravitate towards and like how I need to speak to him. But yeah,
and he clearly defines it for Abram, right? Like, I think it's up to this point we've discussed it. Abram assumed or believed that Lot would probably be that legacy. And I think I love that God is like, no, let me clarify, because I gave you the promise, you didn't seem to understand, so let me clarify. Give you a little bit more. No, this son will come from your own body. Like, this heir will come from your body. And so like he gives him this clarity, and as you said, just reassures him and reaffirms him, despite what Abram is probably doubting at this point based off of the decisions that Lot has made. I wonder maybe if he knew that, he wouldn't have gone to save Lot. He'd just been like, it's on you. But I do love that he kind of gives him this confirmation and this clarity, but then also just this confirmation, right? Like, these the symbols of the animals and the birds and these kind of things, like, all of this was just simply like, look, let me show you that I mean it. Like, this is again a symbol of my promise, back to like the rainbow and this, like, it's just another symbol of like, I meant it when I said it, but like, I also just want you to see the confirmation of it, for you to believe it, not because it changes anything about what I was going to do. I was going to stay by my word one way or the other, but it's just to help you remember and help you believe what it is that I said.
That's good.
What I was going to say, it might spill a little bit into chapter 16, but I wanted to just really touch bases on like what I can relate with Abram is like hearing a word from the Lord and knowing that there's a promise, but thinking that it's up to me to get there and to make it happen. And like coming up with my own plan or way of how that's going to happen. And to hear like, again, he didn't even think that like God was going to bring the son through him. Like he's like, okay, well, this is going to happen in this way. And then we later see again them putting their hands on it and like, okay, well, we about to use Hagar to bring me a son. Like how easy it is for us to again like know the promise that God has given us and feel like we're the ones that's gonna be, you know, plan it out to what we think is gonna be.
Yeah.
And I think like it's important to understand like what's happening at the end of Genesis 15, because like how covenants were formed is like when God is asking man to halve the pieces and cut the animals in half, he's telling them to walk through, like people used to walk through, and if you didn't follow the covenant, that the things that you did to the animals, that will be done to you. And like it's important to note, because when you get to verse 17, both people are supposed to pass through, but it says that when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed to the pieces. So like in the Old Testament, we see that the fire represents God. But Abram doesn't pass through, because what God is saying is, I know you will break my covenant because I know your heart is continually evil. And it's like, even in that, I'm going to still take the burden off of you through my son eventually. But this covenant shows that I'm always going to be with you despite what you do.
Took the words out of my mouth.
Okay.
That's really good. And I love that he came and spoke to Abram in the way that he understood. And he did the covenant in the way that he was familiar with, right? Like these are things that he has probably done himself, right? But to make that and say, like you said, it's on me. Like this covenant's on me.
That part.
And I think, like you were saying earlier, I'm sorry, but how you were saying like the Lord speaks in visions, and like this vision happened when Abram fell into a deep sleep. And so that just shows that there's beauty in Sabbath, because the Lord can reveal more about himself to you when you rest.
Come on, you better say that
and I love it. This is the second time we see a deep sleep, because Adam was first.
Exactly.
And now we see another deep sleep that happens, and that something occurs during this sleep. It's just like, to me, it's just like, ooh, perk up. Let's see what's happening, because whatever's happening is big.
Exactly.
That's good.
Well, you know, Collin alluded to it. Abram doesn't do his part. This is why God never expected him to.
Half obedience.
Yeah, right. And as Shameeka alluded to, he does try to do it his own way. He and Sarai, and you know, Victoria actually previewed this even as we were talking about them in Egypt. But we get Hagar and ultimately Ishmael. This comes. I do love just to call out, I mean, that at this point, Abram had been in Canaan 10 years by the time this happens, right? So back to the point we talked about with Noah, like a lot of time has passed. We might have just read this in a couple chapters here.
That's true.
But like from the time that God first calls Abram to leave, right, until this point, I mean, we're at almost 15 years or so, kind of, or 12 years, I think it's total. Because he's been in Canaan 10 years. But remember, before that, it was in Egypt and all that stuff, right? So like a lot of time has passed since he said, this is what I'm going to do. And so Abram is like, well, God, you're not moving fast enough. Or I guess maybe you meant it this way. And maybe you were waiting on me this whole time. So I'll go ahead and do my part. And that's where we get this idea of Abram and Hagar. Anything that just jumps out to you about this story that we've referred to a little bit since, but anything that just jumps out to you in the way it's written here in chapter 16?
But just like you said, in verse 3, it says that they have been living in Canaan 10 years. Once again, the number 10, a test is coming. And like, just look at the language they sent around Hagar. It says, go sleep with my slave in verse 2. Then it says, Sarah, his wife, gave the Egyptian slave Hagar to her husband to be his wife. So now Hagar is a wife. Then in the next verse, it says that she began to despise her mistress. So now Hagar is a mistress. And then later on, it says your slave is in your hands. So Hagar is now back to a slave. And there's like this stair-step structure that's happening in Genesis. And like the thing that I really relate to the most is like, Hagar didn't ask for any of this.
That part.
Like, she was just minding her business, and all of this happened. And, you know, like, sometimes situations can happen to you even when you're being obedient. But the question is, can you deal with the suffering and still serve me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because even the Lord never refers to Hagar as Abram's wife.
Yeah.
It's always Sarai's slave. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. Because that wasn't
although-
something he ordained. Like,
yeah.
he's like, I wasn't in this. Y'all did this. Yeah. I don't understand why she didn't get mad at herself, Sarai. Because, like, you the one who gave her over, and then now you want to get mad at her.
Yeah, because it worked, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes. It's understandable that there's a level of regret, right? That in an emotional state or moment that make a call or decision, and now regret making that decision, right? Which I feel is ultimately where Sarai was. And again, back to, we keep bringing this up, this community and accountability. Like, there's equal responsibility here. There was equal responsibility in Egypt when he gave her up to the Egyptian kings. There's equal responsibility here when she gave Hagar to him, that Abram also had the right and the ability to be like, no, I'm not doing this, right? And so, like, there is this, like, consistent theme of, like, okay, if we're gonna do this together, we got to be able to hold each other accountable, and we got to be able to do that. And so yeah, I think that's where she does blame Abram, and she's like, well, you could have said no, you didn't have to, as well. So yeah, I thought it was interesting that, like, as she runs away, as Hagar runs away, it's just always so interesting to me that, like, God sends her back.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and he's like, no, I need you to go back. And again, you just kind of brought this up a little bit in the sense of, like, again, she didn't ask for any of this, but, like, she's called to endure, like, to stay and to see that happen. And so I find it so interesting that God sends her back into that affliction, into that difficult situation, ultimately because, again, there's a purpose for it, right? There's a purpose for Ishmael, and he eventually will bless Ishmael as well. But, like, yeah, I just think it's so interesting that he didn't let her just run away from her problems.
Yeah.
But, like, he called her and encouraged her to go back and stick it out and endure and see it to the end, which I just think is so challenging and interesting. Because I think, again, it's not my nature to embrace conflict, right? And to, like, walk into conflict, but instead to try to avoid it. And so I was really challenged by this passage myself.
Yeah, I think that section is so layered because, like, the angel literally says, I see that you're suffering, now go back and suffer. And it's like, when the angel asks her, where have you come from and where are you going? She replies back and say, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah, but she never answers where she's going. And there's a certain level of favor that comes through serving, even in the midst of suffering. And I think that sometimes, like, we see the story of Hagar and we're trying to figure out, like, why she's suffering. And I just, like, mourn for Hagar, because I'm like, God's telling me to go back to suffer. But I'm like, but if Hagar could have been around in the New Testament, she would have understood that God is really setting me up to be Jesus and be the suffering servant. And so, like, there's sometimes situations where God calls us back to that, that place to serve. Maybe it might be work, maybe it might be that house, but it's like God is setting you up to be an example for somebody else and to deliver you through that.
Yeah.
I think I love that even in all of this, when he tells her to return, he gives her some hope of, I will surely multiply your offspring so they cannot be numbered for multitude. And I think for me this is interesting because he promises that he would multiply her offspring even before we get to when Abram, later on in these chapters, when Abram asks, if only Ishmael was acceptable to you, Lord. And the Lord's like, don't worry, I heard you. I'm going to bless Ishmael too, and I will, multiply his descendants and all that. But it's like, it was consistent. It was consistent with what he already told Hagar. Like, he had already told her that he would be multiplied, but we don't see the Lord saying the same thing to Abram yet. And so
Yeah. I love the Lord's compassion for Hagar. And, you know, just being a God that did see her and ultimately her, you know, in verse 13, so she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roy," for she said, "In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me." And like, I think that even speaks to, again, the environment she was in. Like, she didn't really feel seen by, like, you know, Sarah and like Abram, and she knew she was being used for, you know, as a puppet, if you will, for like what they wanted. But she's like, man, no, this person actually sees me. Yeah. And how comforting that is. And so maybe that is a part of her obedience to go back, is that like, okay, I trust God because he actually sees me, and I believe that he has, you know, my best interests at heart.
Yeah. No, I mean, like you said, that passage, man, and that verse, what Hagar says, it's like, I feel like we can all just be there with her. Like, that's so good. And I love, you know, one of the points you guys have made since we've been in this discussion this week is that, like, you know, God's intention from day one, as much as this story will give us the lineage of the Israelites and ultimately, you know, Jesus will come from this line. It's said elsewhere in scripture too, like, God's intention was always for all people. And I love that, like, Hagar is kind of an example. Like, she's this Egyptian slave. She's not an Israelite, right? And like, but God sees her too. Like, and God is like, he has compassion on her too, and he feels for her too. And I think for those of us, and I can speak for myself, like, I'm a Gentile, right? Like, I am not Jewish, like, never have been, but like, to come out of this and say, man, like, from day one, like, God has always cared about me too. Like, it wasn't just once Jesus came that all of a sudden he was like, okay, now let me open this up to everybody else. Like, from the beginning, man, he's always cared about all of us. And and so, yeah, that resonates a lot. But we gotta we kind of come to the conclusion of our week here in this last chapter, and there's this covenant, another covenant, right? Now, this first covenant was God's kind of promise to Abram. Now we kind of have an expectation from God of what, Abram, you need to do now to kind of keep your covenant, your promise, and we kind of see that here in chapter 17. What jumps out to you guys in chapter 17 as we wrap kind of this week?
I think before this, I was wondering if Abram had walked with God the way that Noah did, or Enoch, you know. And I feel like there's this invitation, like right now in this first verse, to like, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. And I'm just like, yeah, this whole time, has he been walking with God? Like, and I wonder if this is like an invitation to shift their relationship.
Yeah.
And like, all right, let's stop walking and doing your own thing. Like, walk with me, be blameless, and then so that I can make this covenant between me and you, right? And I can multiply you. And I think this is invitation to be close to him. His invitation to like live a certain lifestyle.
Yeah, because the whole time I was thinking that he wasn't walking like how Noah was and was like done before him. So I do like that God is pointing this out, like, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I desire from you. And God's persistent. Like, God is so persistent with Abram, and I'm just like, oh, but why? Like, what made you keep on wanting to like bless him in the way that you wanted to? It's like, I'm just like, I just did not understand and still don't. And I think a lot of times when we do think about Abraham, we a lot of times think about, like, you know, eventually when it gets to Isaac and like, you know, him, you know, choosing sacrifice. But us walking through this journey, like, I'm like, oh wait, he's not he doesn't seem like a perfect candidate
Yeah.
for the type of blessing that God is trying to give him. Like, so seeing God's persistence in this all has been like mind blowing.
I think the verse that sticks out to me is verse 23. And after God tells him to circumcise the males, Abraham takes Ishmael to be circumcised. And just like you were saying, Eric, is like, you know, it was one thing for God to tell Hagar that he sees her, and it's another thing to Abraham to show that he sees Ishmael, because it would have been so easy to cash Ishmael out because he doesn't, like, he's not technically the promise. But it's like the fact that Ishmael is circumcised with the rest of the Israelites, it shows, like, even to today, like, God still has chosen those who aren't considered Israelites.
They said at this point, he's already been confirmed that the son is coming from Sarah, right? That God is so, you know, it's not like he still thinks Ishmael is that promise, right? Which at this point, it's been 13 years. Ishmael's 13, we come to find out, right? Like, so God, he hasn't heard anything in 13 years. He has a teenage son at this point. Now all of a sudden he hears something that's different. But to your point, you said he could have just been like, well, Ishmael, you're not it. You're not the one, right? And so, but he kept him and considered him his son and still part of his family.
I love the immediacy of his obedience, though, because, I mean, the Lord changed, you know, him and Sarai's name. And the next time that Abraham mentions Sarai, he calls her Sarah, right? Like, it's not like it took him a while to acknowledge. Like, this is in conversation. Like, you're going to call Sarai Sarah, and then, you know, the next verse, he was like, shall Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear a child? And I'm just like, I love his immediacy in believing and obliging by what God said. And even like you said with the circumcision, like, he did that day. Like, it wasn't like he waited. He was like, verse 26 is that very day. Like, he took him and Ishmael and those who were born in his house and circumcised with him.
Yeah. Which, I mean, thank God we don't have to experience that. But it's a painful process. You know, thing to do, I'm sure. So,
and so many people, like, I'm just thinking, like, years ago you had 318 trained men.
Oh yeah.
I'm just trying to think of, like, how diligent this process must have been and how many people had to be circumcised.
That's
like,
true.
This wasn't no easy task.
Yeah, it's good. Well, I know we've kind of come to the conclusion of this week. It's a lot here. We still have a lot to say about Abraham. Now we can call him Abraham from here on out, right? He's been Abram up to this point. So he changes his name and ultimately for a purpose, he and Sarah. But we're going to get a lot more of Abraham next week. And so a lot more to unpack and discover there. But before I just kind of wrap, just thank you all just for your thoughts this week and for sharing with us on Genesis 1 through 17. Thank you for joining us all week and being here and being a part of it. Again, my prayers, if you're doing this reading plan, do not do it alone. Do it with someone. You do it with us. Download the VIBEZ Church app. Join the VIBEZ Daily chat group as a place that you can communicate, or find a friend, family member, neighbor, coworker, somebody that'll just come alongside and commit to reading the scripture with you as we embark on it. I'm excited. You have tomorrow and Sunday off to really just kind of either catch up if you need to, or Sabbath, which we encourage you to do, and just rest. And then we'll be back on Monday with week 2 as we continue through this. But until we see you next week, take care. God bless.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily Podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take good care.